Everybody, welcome to webinar number 24. Come into the room, form an orderly queue, get yourself comfortable. Tell us in the chat, if you can, where in the world you are. If you've had your tea, what have you had for your tea? Are you a social worker? Are you a student? Are you a practice educator? Have you stumbled upon this webinar by accident, in which case you're more than welcome to stay. So where in the world are you? Get yourself comfortable. We can see each other as panelists. We can't see you, don't worry about that. You should be able to see us, should be able to hear us. If you can, send Omar a quick message and he should be able to help you out. So welcome again, and tell us where in the world you are. Are you a social worker? Are you a student? Are you a practice educator? Are you in a related profession and thought this sounded interesting? So let's have a look what's in the chat. Let's see. We have somebody from Cambridge who is a student, Midlands, Bradford, Worcester. These must be all your friends, Claire. It's that kind of area of the country, that.
Our 24th webinar, relationship-based practice, managing endings well, is what we're going to be talking about. Now, this is going to be largely led by our guest tonight, Claire Skilleter. I attended a student hub that Claire ran, and it was fabulous. It was all about endings, and I said, oh, you've got to come and do this for us in a webinar, because it was so fabulous, really, just to learn and to be able to sit back and listen. And endings are so important in social work. We don't think about them enough. I think it's a neglected topic. And one of the things we've been trying to do in our Wednesday webinars is look at things that add to your learning, look at things that maybe aren't being covered on social work training for students, or aren't being covered on follow-up training, but are topics that are really important for us. So the quotation that's come up there, I think it's a C.S. Lewis quotation, says, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. Endings are so important for all of us. And when we were waiting to open up the webinar, Diana was saying, this isn't just about being a professional sometimes, is it? It's about how good are we at dealing with endings in any aspect of our lives. So tonight is a very practical night, full of practical ideas for you to take away and use around working with endings in relationships. If you've been to lots of our webinars, you will know that one of the key foundations of our sessions has been to try and clarify for people what's the difference between a theory, a model, a method and an approach. And if you still feel that you're not clear on that, watch a couple of the other webinars. We did it a lot in webinar 1. We did it again in the theory picnic webinar. There's also the video on my YouTube channel that talks through this key difference, because it is so foundational in terms of our social work practice. Now, relationship-based practice is an overall approach to practice. If we take a relationships-based approach, it means that we know about the importance of relationships. We build on relationships, both in terms of our work with service users, but also in terms of our work with others. You'll know that this year, World Social Work Day, which for so many people, unfortunately, the huge events that were planned didn't take place because it was pretty much when coronavirus hit many of, certainly across Europe. At that point, it was very key to when we went into lockdown. But we know, don't we, based on last year's World Social Work Day topic and this year's World Social Work Day topic was about promoting the importance of human relationships in social work. We know how important relationships are, but relationships-based practice is this overall approach to practice. If I'm honest, if I try and find, let me have something really practical here about relationships-based approach, I very often find there's not anything that's hugely practical. There's a lot of talk about how important relationships are, that relationships sit at the heart of social work practice. But look, let's look for something that's really practical here that we can use. And I don't always find that. And I think that's why I found the work that Claire shared in the Student Hub around endings so helpful. So what we're going to do tonight is look at methods. So if you remember, an approach is your overall way of working. A model is how we intervene in a situation. It's all about what we do. So there are models of working in a relationships-based way. But what we're really going to drill into tonight, or what Claire is going to explore with us, is methods, but methods which are specifically about endings in relationships. So one book that I have found very useful in terms of thinking through relationships-based practice is from McMullen. McMullen, she talks about a 4-stage model for building relationships in social work. And the whole book works through this 4 stages of engage, negotiate, enable, and endings. So engaging is the start of the relationship building process, isn't it? It involves the use of soft skills to develop rapport. It's about how do you communicate with people? How do you begin to establish a relationship with somebody? And then the negotiation phase is all about how do we agree the expectations and the boundaries of the relationship? How is the relationship going to work? What's going to be the boundaries? How is this going to operate for us as a relationship? The enable, that's all about the purpose of the relationship, really. In social work, one of the key things is it's very easy to talk about how important relationships are, but we've got to think about what's the purpose of the relationship. Why are we engaging in this relationship? We're not having a relationship for the sake of having a relationship. In a friendship, we might have a relationship just for the sake of having a relationship. We don't do that in professional practice. There's a purpose to this relationship. You could be great at building relationships, but what about the enabling stage? Are you able to provide the information that somebody needs, the advice, the support, whatever it is to create change for this person? Are you able to use that relationship to enable the individual? It's all about enacting the purpose of that professional relationship. And then endings. Endings is what we're going to focus in on tonight. But as McMullen says, it's important to value the ending process just as much as the building process of relationships. And in McMullen's book, well, McMullen acts as an editor, but actually a lot of the chapters are what she contributes. This sits at the center. So every chapter has this at the beginning, this diagram, this engage, negotiate, enable, endings, and it's drawn up pretty much like this. And that might be how it looks a lot of the time, because we might end our relationship with somebody, but they stay in the service. So then it's about engaging with somebody else. Or the endings arrow might not continue round in the cycle. When we're working with somebody, endings might mean that that person goes to somewhere else, or that they're no longer in the relationship, they're no longer in the service. So the endings part could actually take us off in a slightly different direction. Now, if you look at that, engage, negotiate, enable, endings, is there anything there that you see that connects those things? When I looked at it, you'll know that I read now in a very different way than I used to. If you watched the webinar on shame, you know, I talked about my experience of having a stroke and how I relearned to read. And I read now in a very different way. And something jumped out at me straight away about those 4 words and how that sits within relationships. The thing that jumped out at me about those 4 words was the E and the N. What we've got is engage, enable, we've got endings. Even if you look at the word negotiate, it's got an N and then an E. There's a whole thing about EN. So I started to explore that, thinking, well, what EN words are? There's loads of words that begin with EN that relate to relationships. So I'm going to ask you just to put some of those words. Can you think of words that begin with EN and put those into the chat? It almost looks like, when I put the ones up that I've thought of, that actually it looks like I've swallowed an encyclopedia. And of course that begins with EN as well. But look at all of those words there that all relate into relationships, the environment. Where are we engaging in relationships? What about encouragement that we can give to people in relationships? What about the way that relationships enrich our lives? And How about the entrance to a relationship? How do we begin a relationship? All of those words and many more words in terms of relationships begin with EN. But the big one, the most important aspect in many ways of relationships beginning with EN, is all about endings. How do we plan for endings? What do we do with endings when we're working with people as social workers? How do we manage those endings of relationships? And to look at that, if I'm entirely honest with you, I'd always thought about, in a kind of, I suppose, almost a theoretical way or just a clarity way, about the importance of endings and kind of planning for endings. But I don't think I'd ever really used as many creative methods as I could do around how do we end relationships, as I learned about in the student hub that I joined Claire for. So Claire will tell you, or well, it's actually on our social media account, so you've probably all seen it, and on the posters, a little bit of an introduction for Claire, and Claire will introduce herself and her role. But I first met Claire at a conference quite a long time ago. We're also connected on social media, as both being practice educators and very committed to working with students and being practice educators. And one of the things that I love about Claire is she does these very creative student hubs where students come together, and there's these, and on social media I used to see all these pictures of creative things that Claire had been doing in hubs. And I said one day, can I gate crash one of your hubs? I'd love to come along and just, and I think we planned it 3 or 4 times, Claire, and it always fell through for some reason, didn't it? And in the end it fell through because of lockdown. The hubs weren't happening in person. So, but I was able to still attend via Zoom. I think, I don't know if it was Zoom or Teams or something. Anyway, I attended virtually a session where Claire looked with a group of students at endings, because I think their placements were coming towards a conclusion at the time, Claire. And from that session, I learned loads about creative methods. So tonight, Claire is going to lead us in a session all about creative methods in endings. So remember, this sits in the context of an overall approach, a relationship-based approach to practice. You could look at models of relationships that talk about the importance of endings, but this is all about the methods, the how do we do it stuff. And I'm going to control the slides, so we might end up being a bit like one of those government things where they go, next slide please. You can just call me Chris Whitty if you want to. That's what I'm going to do for the night. So Claire will tell me when she wants to move the slides over, but it's over to you, Claire. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Siobhan. And thanks for having me, everybody, Siobhan and all of the students who I just met before the session. That was really exciting. It was like meeting celebrities. So yes, my name's Claire Skilleter, and I work as a practice education lead in Norfolk and Suffolk Teaching Partnership. And part of my role is supporting practice educators and supporting students and placements in general. And as Siobhan said, one of the things I do regularly is hold student hubs, which are basically a meeting for students to attend once a month. We pick a particular, so the students choose a particular subject, and we do some input and discussion around that. So tonight I'm just imagining that I'm talking to 15 students in a student hub, and not an enormous amount of people in an international webinar. So that's my mindset for this evening to help me get through. So yes, so as Siobhan said, we're going to concentrate on endings, and just to go back to the Macmillan model, that Siobhan was telling us about, beginnings and endings are equally important. And I think what we can sometimes do is rush over endings in our day-to-day practice. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So beginnings and endings, both really important in a relationship. And we all have experience of endings. So I guess when we're thinking about why is it that we maybe don't give as much attention to endings in practice, it's interesting considering we all have our own experiences of endings. If you think, those of you that are students, if you think about the PCF 7 asks you to demonstrate the ability to engage, build, manage, sustain and conclude compassionate and effective relationships. So those relationship building skills, and in particular the ability to conclude compassionate and effective relationships, is part of the things that you'll be evidencing on placement. So endings happen to all of us, and endings happen on a daily basis, really. So if you think about endings in relation to students and practice educators, because of the nature of your placements, every placement is time limited, isn't it? It has an enforced ending. You don't really get a choice about when your placement ends. It ends at 80, 70, 100 days. So that ending is imposed on the student, it's imposed on the practice educator, and it's imposed on the service users that the student is working with. And yet there's very little written about how to support practice educators and students to manage endings effectively. And sometimes I think the pressure of ending a placement, you've got you to transfer your service users maybe to another worker. Your practice educator's got to write the final report. You've got to get your portfolio together. You've got to get your feedback all in. So sometimes those things can overshadow the importance, I think, of taking time to prepare and mark the end of your placement. I'm always reminded in thinking about us all experiencing endings, I might refer a few times to the words of Annie, Safeguarding Survivor, who appeared on one of the earlier webinars, because I know that one of Siobhan's favourite quotes from Annie, and it's one of mine as well, is that there is no them and us, only we. And I think in terms of endings, that's a really powerful thing to remember, because we all have experience of endings. It isn't about service users ending, and we're going to talk about ways to support service users with endings, but it's also about us having those endings as well. We've all had experiences in our personal and our work lives of endings, and some of those are planned, some are unexpected, some are helpful, and some are really painful. So we all have those major life events that are around endings, but we also have these endings that happen on a daily basis. So think about the end of a telephone call, the end of your supervision session, the end of a home visit. And thinking about how you manage those endings is also really important. So you've got that sort of macro and micro level, really, in thinking about how you do endings. So endings are a really emotive subject, and many of us might be triggered into thoughts and feelings and behaviours that are related to previous experiences, maybe of loss or grief. And sometimes we're triggered into those feelings again when we talk about endings that are happening in the present. And so I wonder if sometimes that's why we can avoid paying attention to endings, because we can often have associations with our own endings that might be being re-triggered when we end with service users. So sometimes for any of us, we could have an exaggerated response to an ending. So think about that in terms of like a double amount of emotions. It's like the emotions that are left over from the past and your new emotions related to this current ending. So you can have almost emotions from the past and emotions from the current ending. So you've got a double whammy, a double dose of emotions, you and the service user most likely. You might find that you or the service user have a fight, flight or freeze response to endings. You know, people may become punishing, they may become angry, they may try and avoid endings, they may run away from an ending by not being there for your last appointment. People may disassociate and just not be able to talk about endings. But if we can provide a well thought out ending, we can provide a more manageable experience for people. And I guess what we're trying to do tonight is look at some ways that you may be able to make endings more manageable for people and maybe for yourself. And then maybe we can give people a different association. We can give people the opportunity to build some different associations with endings. Endings are also a really good opportunity to review and consolidate knowledge that's been gained from a relationship or a piece of work, and to think about how you can build on that for the future. So they're a really good learning opportunity for all of us. And in fact, I was thinking that it links a bit to, Siobhan will do this, has done this in hubs before, reflecting for, reflecting in and reflecting on. And I think lots of the activities we're going to do are going to help you reflect for ending. They're going to help you reflect in ending and to help you reflect on endings. So before we move on, we're going to get us thinking a little bit about our own responses to endings by having a poll, which I'm fingers crossed is going to work. Omar's going to put it up now. I know some of you can't see the poll. I'm going to read out the question so you could be thinking about it. So thinking about our own experiences of endings, do you think that these experiences impact on the way you approach endings with service users? So do you think your own experiences impact on the way that you approach endings? And we've got yes of about 80%, I think, at the moment. No is about 7% and not sure is about 15–16%, I think. So quite overwhelmingly, people are realizing that their own experiences of endings are impacting on the way that they approach service user endings or endings with other people. So Pola's ending, yes, 76% say yes, those experiences do impact on the way we approach endings with service users. Do I just click the cross to get out of the poll? Let's get it off my screen, people. Yeah. Don't want to, yeah, okay, cool. Lovely. Okay, so yeah, so I'm hoping that some of the things that we're going to do today are going to help you really reflect on those experiences of endings and how they may be impacting on your approach to endings. So next slide, please, Mr. Whitty. Cool. So we're going to look at today a range of creative tools for endings. We're going to look at an activity called Special Boxes, Sensory Endings Stick Person, Practice Educate a Student Reflection Letter, a Rainy Day / Bad Letter Weather, Service User Letter, and Appreciative Presence Posters. That's a few tools. I think the hub that Siobhan came to, I did more because the hubs are a little bit longer, but there's a book reference at the bottom of that slide, that's a book that's coming out next year about creative approaches to social work practice learning. And I've got a couple of chapters and in there around different tools and approaches. And there's lots of other really talented people who have written similar chapters around creativity and different tools and things. So thank you. So before we look at the tools though, there's one more slide in just thinking about how we might use any practice tool. So just thinking about the importance of any tool you use, we need to think about relationship-based practice. So the quality of the relationship matters a great deal. We know that the quality of relationships really impacts on the outcome of the work. So try and think relationship first, tool second. Think about emotional containment, having empathy, providing safety and predictability for people. So any tool that you use, those are the main things that you're trying to create in terms of that relationship that you're using the tool within. Because we often represent a threat to service users, so our presence in their lives, using tools, techniques, etc. with them can evoke all sorts of emotional responses. And we need to be aware of that and think about how we respond. Emotional containment could be a whole other webinar, but if you want to read a bit more and think a bit more about emotional containment, the work of Wilfred Bion, Gillian Roosh, David Howe, some really easily accessible writers on emotional containment. So the process and the discussion and being respectfully curious are vital. So the process is more important than the art. So some of these are around using drawings and art, but just bear in mind that with any tool, it's the process that's the most important thing. It's the discussion and the respectfully curious questioning that we'll talk a little bit about later on that are the really important points. Third object theory. If there's students that are in my hub in the audience, they'll be going, oh no, she's on about third object theory. Again, we've heard that 100 times. But third object theory, which comes from the work of Donald Winnicott way back in the sort of 50s and 60s. And it's simply the idea that if you have a third object that you can concentrate on together, it can make talking about difficult things a little bit easier. It gives you a shared sense of doing, and it can also help in terms of having less eye contact and something else to concentrate on. And that can be whether you're doing this activity as a practice educator and a student, or a social worker and a service user. Those of you that have driven children as a social worker in your car will probably realise that children will tell you so much more on a car journey than they will if you're sitting face to face across a desk at their school or something, because the car and the scenery going by in terms of third object theory, something else to focus the mind on. You don't have to make eye contact. So lots of the activities that we're going to be looking at are your third object. They're the other thing that you can concentrate on to help have a discussion that might be a bit tricky. Understanding the individual's biography, their life story, what endings might mean to them, what this practice tool might mean to them, really important. So just having a think about, what do I know about my service user what do I know about the service user I'm going to use this activity with? How does that knowledge of their biography and their life story influence the way that I'm going to approach this? And just to say that these tools won't suit everybody, so offer choice around them, and if any of the tools that we're going to talk through don't resonate with you, or they don't fit with your service user or your student, then just think about what's the thinking behind the tool, and can I use that thinking in a different way? Can I use that thinking to influence a discussion, or can I adjust the tool and make that tool more accessible to me, my student, or the service user? So, you know, when we're talking about creative tools, be creative with them. Think about using the tools on yourself or with a trusted colleague. I simply ask the question, should we expect a service user to do anything that we're not prepared to do ourselves? It's really important just to think about, before you can understand the power of emotions in someone else's life, we need to understand the power of emotions in our own life. And sometimes trying the tool out for yourself, the method out for yourself, or trying it out with a trusted colleague can just help us think a little bit about what it might feel like to have this tool, to work with this method, and to receive that. It's also really good for thinking about what your own triggers might be and being aware of that. Again, I'm reminded of the webinar that Annie came to when she did that really powerful exercise where she convinced us all that she was going to name someone and say, tell us your deepest, darkest secret. If you were, I was thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to do that. So really similar, you know, we're asking people to tell us lots of really emotive things. So just think about how that might feel and try using the tools out yourself. And finally, work hard to develop a relationship of trust from the entrance. So the moment that you enter the service user's life, or indeed as a practice educator, the moment that you enter the student's life, think about working to develop that relationship from that point. You'll have more chance of ending well. There's some work by Aaron Kramer, and I'm going to send you the team are going to send you the references. I'm going to send them tomorrow of the bits and pieces of literature that I've mentioned. But Aaron Kramer writes about poor endings are often linked to us not paying enough attention to the earlier stages of relationship building. So just think about starting that right from the beginning. That's fine. Thanks, Siobhan. You can go there to the next one. And that sort of just takes us on to this quote that Siobhan and I both love. And I know Siobhan's used it before, and I use it a lot in student hubs. But Maya Angelou said that I've learned that people will forget what you said, and they'll forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Maya was a Black civil rights activist and the author of a book called I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. But I think that can just take that into working with tools with service users, because there is a huge amount of importance on supporting individuals to feel as safe as possible when they're using tools and techniques, and we're asking them to share some of their most inner sort of thoughts and feelings. Okay, and on that subject, actually, I'm reminded again, Annie's just popped into my head again, about the fact that she said she remembered every social worker that she'd had, and she remembered how they made her feel. So yeah, so think about that as we go through. So, okay, let's move on to some of the tools that you might like to take into your practice. So this slide, special boxes. So you can use any phrase to describe these boxes. You could call them sparkle boxes, strengths boxes, positive moments boxes, learning boxes. Karen Treisman, the worker Karen Treisman, she calls them treasure boxes, and does something a little bit similar with them. And the sort of background in terms of like thinking about what's behind the influence behind these. Think about reciprocity in social work, so giving and receiving, and strengths-based approach. About naming strengths, thinking about how we can use strengths, those sorts of things. And this is a tool that helps you prepare for endings right at the very beginning of your working relationship, because the idea is that at each time you have your session, your visit, your supervision with somebody, that you collect their positive memory or their strength or their special moment, you write it on a card and you keep it safe in the box. And you do that every time you see them. And at the end of your working relationship with that person, you give them the box to take away into their next relationship maybe, or their next piece of work, or to keep as a memory. So I'm going to go through these 3 different boxes, but you'll see on the photograph, what I tend to use are children's party boxes. So that gold box on the slide, there's a particular student in the audience who will recognise that box, that I use party boxes that I just buy and can fold up, and I use pieces of coloured card and paper to write the notes on. So placement positive box. So this is a box that practice educators and students can use, and it helps you pay attention to endings on a daily basis, and it helps you work towards the end of placement. So what I would do is that at each supervision, as a way of ending supervision, I ask the student for their treasure moment or their positive moment or their most successful moment from placement that week. We write it on the card, pop it in the box, and we build a placement positives box. And at the end of placement, they take away the placement box with them, maybe into their next placement where they can build on that box, or maybe into their newly qualified year where they can build on that box. And then that box can become their social work strengths box. So the other way of using these boxes are for social workers, practitioners in general, to have your own social work strengths box, have it sitting on your desk, and have a pile of cards, and try to write your strengths moment as a social worker, things that you do well, things that you're pleased about, pop it in your box. It's a really useful way if you think about your CPD, because you could record positive events that you've had or events that you want to reflect on and learn from more. It's also in COVID times and working from home. Some social workers have told me recently that they're using their box as a way of ending their day and moving into the evening. So it's sort of a way of recognizing, okay, I'm going to write down my strength from today, pop it in my box, I've finished work for the day. So it very much links to self-care as well, noticing the positives, those sorts of things. And finally, the last box is our working together memory box to use with service users. So exactly the same principle. I mean, I've used these a lot with children. My background is really purely children and families. And so at each visit or each session that you have with a child or with a family or with an adult, you talk about what have you most enjoyed from this visit, or what do you most want to remember from this visit, and you or the service user writes it on the card and puts it in the box. At the end, and again, in terms of think about safety and predictability, which are really important in social work, helping people feel safe, helping people feel that we're predictable and reliable. If you end a session or a visit in the same sort of way every time, that really helps somebody with the predictability of my session is coming to an end. I know what's going to happen. We're going to do our memory box. So really helpful for creating rituals and routines. Helpful because it signifies the end of the session. My social worker's going to go now, come back next week, we'll do the same thing. Again, at the end of your work with a service user, then the memory box is something that you give to them to keep. You can adapt those ideas. You could use books, posters, sparkle boards, but think about how you can make it personal as well. So sometimes you might decorate a box, but you can adapt those ideas and think about how you can move forward with them. But really, really positive in terms of helping prepare for endings. Okay, thank you, Siobhan. The next slide we're going to look at, I must just credit Rosie, because if you'd have seen the original person on this slide, you would have had a real hoot, but this is Rosie's version and it's absolutely lovely. I was so pleased when I saw it. So this activity is called Endings Stick Person, or Endings Sensory Stick Person, and really it's a planning tool for endings. I originally developed this to facilitate wishes and feelings conversation with children, but I've adapted it here to think about having conversations to plan for endings. Again, this is a tool you can use as a practice educator with your student, or a tool you could slightly adapt the wording of and use with a service user. So this tool is influenced really by a sort of sensory and visual approach, particularly the work of Clark and Morris, 2015. The reference will be on your information. And they talk about visual approaches being really powerful because they provide a way of sensing and experiencing and expressing and seeing the social work world. It's also influenced by Siobhan and her colleagues' work around SHARE, which you will have come across or been mentioned in previous hubs because it uses the human senses. And social work is a multi-sensory experience. Some of you might be familiar with Harry Ferguson's work around child protection and home visiting, and he pays attention to those sensory elements of visiting families like smell and how that can trigger different responses in social workers. So ending stick person. So it helps you plan for ending, and it helps you think about triggers for thoughts and feelings around endings. We're going to talk about it in the sense of using a practice educator using it with a student, but you can adapt it slightly and use it for service users. I usually undertake this round about the midpoint of placement because it's something that you're going to revisit in supervision. But you could start it earlier than that. So it helps you to explore how you may plan for the ending and what the student might be thinking about in terms of ending a placement. You can do it virtually on a template, and we're going to send some templates out tomorrow, or you can do it face-to-face on a very large sheet of paper. Student draws out a stick person of themselves, you do the bubbles and you write the words in the speech bubbles, and you can decorate it, etc., as much as you like. Again, really important about unpicking the conversation, but this slide gives you some prompts for discussion around each of these elements. So thinking, for example. So the thinking bubble coming out of your head is the opportunity to talk about what memories or thoughts do you have about previous endings, and how might those memories or thoughts influence this ending. Hearing, so things like, what do you want to hear about when we end our work? Who would you like to hear from? Why might it be important to hear from that person? Seeing, what would you like your ending to look like? Who would you like to see on your final day? Why is it that you want to see that person? Speaking and tasting, what might you like to say when we end our work? What special food might you like? Who might you like to speak to? How can we ensure that you're going to have that opportunity? Doing, so that's an opportunity to talk about, what do we need to do before your ending? What would you like to do on your final day, your week, to mark the ending? How will you involve service users? How will you involve each service user in planning for the end of your work? Feelings is about, how do you feel right now about ending placement? How might you feel on your final day? Why might you feel that way? How might you manage those feelings? And so on. Walking away, at the bottom, the feet, is about, what new learning do you want to achieve before you walk away from placement, and how might you do that? And how will you know that that's happened? And imagine moving on from this placement. What will you carry with you in your toolkit into your next placement? How hard might it be to walk away from this placement, and what would make it easier? So that gives you some ideas around the discussion that would go with census stick person. And those are really ideas to get you started in that conversation. I like to so I do stick person with a student, and then I revisit it, because it gives us an opportunity to reflect on how feelings and plans might be changing about ending as we approach those final weeks. You can really see, I hope, how you can transfer that to working with a service user. I always think about service users not having a lot of control over endings, because it's usually the social worker or the agency that's decided to end the service. This can be a really good way to work with somebody to just have those conversations about, how can you have some say in how we do this ending? Really important for children, because lots of children that we work with, of course, have had very little control over their endings. So if you think about children who are looked after, etc., and preparing for endings and thinking about how you're going to end your relationship with a child in those circumstances, this can be really helpful. And if you're a student, you know that that's going to end, so you can start planning for that. Okay, I'm aware of time, so we will plod on to the next one, Siobhan, please. So this is, we're going to talk about 3 types of letters, and the first one we're doing here is a student practice educator end of placement reflection letter. The slide that you've got up at the moment is showing you the template, and we're going to send you the template. But the letter writing is really closely associated with narrative therapy. People like the writings of White, I think it's David White, is it White and Epstein, and also used a lot in therapeutic work. Again, Karen Treisman talks about therapeutic letter writing. But the end of placement reflection letter is a letter to yourself from yourself, and it's for the practice educator to do and the student to do. And you'll see that it has different headings, which we're going to go through in a minute. For practice educators, I think this is a really good way of recording your CPD from each placement. If you do an end of placement reflection letter at the end of each placement and upload it onto Social Work England on your CPD, I think it's a really good reflective tool. And a student could use this to go in their placement portfolio, or it could be a creative way of writing a final sort of reflective piece. If you think about reflective practice, this is reflecting on action, and it uses the what, why, how framework, which Siobhan will have spoken about lots in previous webinars, I'm sure. So it promotes reflection and analysis. So what I would do is the practice educator would write their letter independently and the student would write their letter independently, and then you come together in supervision, maybe your penultimate supervision, one really near the end, and you share your letters together in supervision, and you talk, you know, so you've got the opportunity to extend your reflection and talk to each other about them. So this slide, which shows you the questions that are used on each heading. So there's experiences, feelings, values and beliefs, barriers, learning, skills and tools, and best advice. You can adapt these headings. You don't have to use these ones. There might be ones that suit you better. So things like, what were my most positive experiences? Why were they positive? How have they impacted on me? Feelings, what feelings have I experienced during this placement? Why did I feel that way? And how did I manage those feelings? Values and beliefs, what values and beliefs have been important to me? Why were they important? And how am I going to hold on to those? Barriers, what barriers did I face? What were these related to? Why did those barriers arise? How did I manage and overcome them? Learning, your biggest learning, why you think that was your biggest learning and how that's influenced your practice. And what new skills and tools have you developed? Why are they useful and how can you take those forward? And your best advice to yourself from this placement experience. One of the things I like about doing these is it also promotes the message that learning is lifelong and reciprocal, that the student and the practice educator are learning together in the placement, that it hasn't just been about the student having some learning, that it actually, as a practice educator, you learn new things about yourself every time you have a student. So that's one of our letters, and the second one we're going to look at is a rainy day or bad weather letter, and this is a tool for using with service users, or you can use it, you might find other ways to use it. I have used it with students in different ways. So this slide has got the template on, which again you'll be sent. So the rainy day letter, this is a method of marking your end of work with a service user, and again influenced by a narrative therapy, relationship-based approach and a hopeful approach to social work, because this letter is also about moving forward after you've finished your working relationship, the service user moving forward with hope. So the idea is that you may spend a session towards the end working on this with your service user. The rainy day letter or bad weather letter, again, it's a letter to self, and it's designed to be written and revisited on a day where you feel a bit low, where you need support to get through a difficult day. So it's a letter that has reminders to self of strengths, self-care strategies, learning from the past, other positive reminders. And sometimes those things are really difficult to recall on a day where you don't feel too good. The analogy of a rainy day I use predominantly, but rain isn't unpleasant for everybody. You know, it can limit what you do, and it's usually a bit grey and overcast, but not everybody dislikes the rain. So you can rename it. I sometimes call it bad weather letter, or you can find a different way to describe it. So I work with the service user, with them creating this letter and me facilitating and supporting them to do that. You might do it on a large sheet of paper and decorate it. You might be writing it out on your notebook, take it back, type it up, make it nice, roll it up, tie a ribbon around it. Think about all those things about how do you make something feel nice and how do you make somebody feel valued. So I'm going to, in the next slide, Siobhan, I'm going to talk through each of the headings. And again, there's some little prompts for you. Again, they're ideas. Remember that it's about extending the discussion and being really being responsive to your particular person that you're using this with. But the letter, so helpful things to do. So this is where you have a conversation about, you know, during your rainy, bad weather days, what activities have you learned about that are really helpful? What do you think really helps you get through? Are there helpful places to go? Why do you find those places helpful? What are the things in the past that you have learned have helped you the most? So helpful things to do becomes a list of reminders that that person can go to and use to guide them on a day when they don't feel so good. Helpful people to call. In my day, when I started out, it just used to be to call, but now it's to email or text. So helpful people to call or email or text. So who are the helpful people to speak to when you're having a rainy day? What makes that person a good person to call? Are there any organisations that might be a help? Who has been helpful to you in the past? Reminders of learning from other rainy days or bad weather days. And this is where, as the service user social worker, you have a real role in noticing and wondering, you know, because it can be difficult for any of us to identify our learning or our strengths. So you might need to do a bit of noticing. I noticed when, or I wonder if when that happened. So reminders of what did you learn from previous rainy days? What have you learned about yourself from that? What learning would you want to be reminded of when you have another rainy day? Great things about me. So what are the positive qualities about you that you may need reminding of on a rainy day? What are the great things that you've noticed about yourself this year or in the past? What have other people noticed about you? What would other people say? You can extend those questions. These are just ideas to get you started. A memory that helps me realise I can manage. So can you think of a time when you overcame a difficult situation? What skills or strategies or qualities helped you overcome that? So trying to get someone to really form a picture of a memory that can help them realise that they have the strength to manage and overcome the current situation. And I mentioned about it being hopeful. So hopes for the future. What are your hopes and goals for the future, and how can you use those to help focus your mind on where you're trying to get to? And really, a lot of this is around helping people see that moving on from their relationship with you, there'll be a tool left that they can use in terms of self-care and positive reminders. So it is vital the way that you use the questioning. So do think about wondering and noticing. I wonder what it is about you that got you through that experience. I noticed you were really good at such and such. You can also use this letter for a group activity. So you can adjust it. You can use it as an ending activity for, I've used it for parenting groups. As an ending activity, you can adjust it and use it as a team building exercise. If you make it with a service user or anyone I've used, glitter, pens, collage, you can use the template. Again, you can think about different creative ways to use it depending on your service user. But I do try and make it feel special and that it's an act of giving a gift. So putting it in a gold envelope or tying a ribbon around it, those sorts of things can be helpful. Okay, so the last letter that we're going to talk about, continuing the theme of letter writing, this is a different type of letter, and it really comes from thinking about trying to provide some control to service users in terms of endings. And one of the things that happens a lot, obviously, as a student placement, your placement's going to end. Sometimes that service user will be transferred to another worker. Sometimes they're transferred to a different service. We know that in the agencies we work in, often service users are moved around because of different responsibilities and roles in different teams. And obviously we pass on the electronic notes, go to the next worker, or before that, paper files, go to the next worker. But service users aren't really involved in that process. So this is a way of involving the service user in the information that's going to go to the next worker. And so this is offering the service user an opportunity with you or on their own to write a letter to the next worker. And I use these 3 headings, but you can play around with it, use different ones, see what your service user wants to do. So, dear new social worker, these are the things I would like you to know about me. That might be something like, I'm going to Annie again, but that might be something like, it's really important that you sit and have a drink with me. These are the important things to me. These are the things that may help us work well together. That may be that it will help me work well with you if you take your shoes off when you come into my house. So those having that opportunity. So one of the ways you can do this is the service user can then give you the letter that you give to the next social worker, or the service user can keep the letter ready for when they meet the new worker, and they can choose whether to give that letter to the new worker. Because actually when they meet the new worker, they might decide, no, I don't want to give you this letter. I don't feel comfortable doing it. Or they might feel, yeah, I can give you this because I'm feeling that you have made a really good entrance, that you're really trying to develop a relationship with me. So I'm going to give you this letter. So you can talk to the service user about that. But it's really about doing with me rather than doing to me. This is how can you involve someone in transferring their case, and I use that word in inverted commas because I can't bear it, but transferring their work to another social worker. So how can you involve them in doing that? The template, again, you'll get that, but it's quite easy to make anyway, but you'll get that on the information in the next couple of days. Okay, so we're moving on. Just do it slowly, Siobhan, so I can have a sip of my water. We're moving on to another activity. This activity is called Appreciative Present Posters. And really, appreciative present posters are an ending gift. So they're very aligned to a strengths-based perspective, and they fit really well with thinking about specific feedback. And in the spirit of appreciation, this activity is really linked to appreciative inquiry and valuing and noticing the best in other people. So it could be the social worker or the student social worker who makes an appreciative present for the service user. Or it could be the practice educator and the placement team that make an appreciative present poster for the student. If you were making an appreciative present poster for a student as a practice educator, you can do a large sheet of paper, as is on the slide. This is my drawing, which just proves you don't have to be an artist to do these things. And you simply get members of your team to write on the present a message that is a message that clearly says what it is that they have appreciated about the student. So something like, I like the way you always said hello in the morning when people came into the office, or I noticed when you worked with so-and-so that you always gave him time to talk. So it's really specific feedback about what you've really appreciated about that student. As a practice educator, you can put this into the student's report. You can lift quotes out of it into the student's final report. And then again, it's given to the student as an ending gift. So again, how can you make it special? How can you present it to the student? In virtual times, How can you gather people's comments virtually, put them into a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, put some music to it and send it to the student? So thinking about how can you do that in a creative way. This one on the slide is one, it's one that I've created, but it has elements of anonymous truth in it. It's a present that I created for a child that I worked with. So I really love these for working with service users of any age. And so the social worker can create this for the service user as part of marking the ending. Or if you're working in a multidisciplinary group and there are several people ending their involvement, you can work together on creating this for the service user. But again, it's particular things that you've really noticed and appreciated about the service user. So this was for a young person that I worked with, and it says things like, I remember when you chaired your review and I was so proud of you. I love your favorite word, cool, and now I use it all the time and think of you. I really enjoyed the time we made cookies and ate them in the garden. So how can you provide something like that in terms of marking your ending and giving a child or a young person or a service user some positive messages about your involvement with them? Also, just thinking about that, you know, not forgetting the tiny things like handwriting a card to someone, handwriting a postcard to someone at the end of a piece of work. Thinking about how you can just use the messages from appreciative presence. So if you don't feel that that's achievable, how can you use some of that message and adjust it into something else? So we're going to try, and we've got one more slide after this, but I think, Omar, we're going to try another poll here, aren't we? And the question's going to be, if you had to choose, so if you had to choose one of these tools that we've shared this evening so far and use it in your practice, what do you think it would be? Special boxes, ending stick person, student and PE reflective letter, rainy day letter, letter to new social worker, appreciative presence poster. So we're going to make you choose one, I'm afraid, which is a bit mean, but we want to see which one. I'd like to see which one's going to come out top, which one's going to be your favourite. This is a difficult poll, somebody's just said. Oh, it's really exciting actually, because it's all shifting about. I think it's looking like special boxes and rainy day letter. Yes. Oh, no, rainy day letters just take, oh, it's so exciting. Rainy day letter and special boxes are about neck and neck. So appreciative present poster coming up. Brilliant. Thank you. That's so exciting. When Siobhan said to me, or can you think of some polls? I was a bit like, oh my God, but that's exciting. Okay, super. Just reflect on, why did you choose that particular tool over the others? Because we all have personal preference for things. We all sit more comfortably with some tools than others. It's important to be aware of that, because we might actually give people choices that are limited by our own preferences. Okay, let me just pop out of that one. Okie doke. Am I all right for time, Siobhan, now going into the last slide? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to end on some sort of top tips, really, for want of a better phrase, about ending working relationships. And so really, to sum up, we've said most of these things, but start thinking about endings right at the beginning, particularly for you students in placement. You know that you're going to have an ending and that you're going to need to plan for it. So start thinking about endings right from the beginning, going back to the Macmillan model about giving beginnings equal importance as to endings. Be clear when you finish work with somebody. So this quote, when you finish working with us, explain why you are moving on and say goodbye. This quote is from a group of young people in East Norfolk, the East Norfolk In-Care Council. And one of my student hubs did a piece of work with them a couple of years back about their best advice to social workers, and this was one of their best pieces of advice, that when you finish working with us, please explain why you are moving on and say goodbye. And they felt that was really important because of the amount of loss and change, etc., that they'd already had in their lives, that when we move on, we need to talk to them about why that is, because they could be imagining all sorts of things that trigger shame and blame responses in them. So say goodbye and explain why you're moving on. Say thank you. Now, some of you might be saying, oh my God, this woman is so idealistic. But so people have shared their story with you. And I know that not all endings with service users are, you're not always going to be able to do these things that I'm talking to you about. And some endings, people may have really difficult responses. They may do the stuff we were talking about at the beginning of the session in terms of fight, flight or freeze response. But saying thank you to people, they have shared their stories with you, their innermost lives and feelings and experiences, and it's something that most of us would avoid at all costs. So just acknowledging that with people. Reflect on your own emotions and experiences of endings, and think about how they impact on the way you approach endings in your work, and use supervision for that. I know, the webinars talk lots about the importance of reflective supervision. It really is important for reflecting on how you feel about endings and your own experiences of them. And just remember that any tool or method or technique is only as good as the person that's using it. You are your best tool. You are your best strength, your best treasure, your best positive moment. It's you using the tool that is the most important thing. And finally, I guess, just remember that the experience of this relationship that you have with the service user, or that you as a practice educator have with the student, this relationship will stay with that person. So again, going back to Annie, who said she remembered every social worker she'd had, and I'm sure lots of us have met people that have said that to us. So just remember that this experience of this relationship will stay with people forever, and we have such an important role in people's lives and trying to make that experience as manageable as we possibly can. And finally, I just wanted to say to Siobhan that she'd put her or Rosie had put some beautiful butterflies on these slides. And I, just as I was as we've been going through the slides, I thought, butterflies are really beautiful, but then they fly away. And I was just thinking about having relationships with people that then fly away, and the importance of ending those well. So thank you very much, everybody, for having me. Thanks, Siobhan. Thank you for doing these webinars and keeping us all connected in this virtual time and having these virtual relationships with people. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass back to Siobhan in a timely manner that I haven't done too badly with.
You've done brilliantly, Claire. Thank you so much. Everybody in the chat is saying it was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you'll be able to see the chat now on what you brought to us. I think what you brought to our webinar tonight, every guest that joins us in a webinar brings something different, and I think shows the diversity of social work and the creativity within social work. But I think what you've really brought to us tonight is a very practical set of, here are some tools that you might be able to use. And I know that, as you were saying, different people like different tools, and the split in that final poll was just amazing, really. The number of people, well, I like this one, I like that one, and people are, I think there was almost people, I'm not voting because I'm not going to choose one. There was a lot of that kind of, just because there was so much, I think. And also, I think what you gave us was the opportunity to be able to I think adapt them. You showed how, look, here's an idea, here's how you might use it with a student, here's how you might use it in this situation, but really showed us the adaptability. So thank you so much for all of that sharing. I know I'm not always very good with endings. I know that. And I think sometimes, I know one of the things that I've learned from you when you've talked about endings is when we say goodbye to people, and we'll sometimes say, oh, well, I'll perhaps see you around, or perhaps see you on the bus, or it's just important to end relationships and to be comfortable with ending things. And those people who are students here, I think about endings. It's really important. And I do think it's a neglected area. I don't know how much you've covered on your own courses about endings and how to do endings, but we wanted to give you some real practical guidelines on something that is, I think, a neglected area. So thank you so much. Thanks for coming, Claire. I've got no doubt we'll be asking you back at some point in the future, because that was a fabulous webinar. So thank you so much for tonight's session. And yeah, perfectly timed. In terms of news for the next couple of sessions, you know that we always end by telling you what's coming up, and the link will come into the chat. I'm looking at the team, and there's a couple of nods. Everybody's ready to put, there we go, it's in there already. So next week our session is looking at age assessments. We'll be joined by a solicitor who will talk about age assessments, and also a person who has been through an age assessment, who will share their experiences of undergoing an age assessment, which I think is something that's actually very challenging for social workers at the moment. And it was a topic that was requested when we did the session on working with families impacted by immigration control. So it's a kind of follow-up from that original webinar that was led by our guest speaker, Nick. So next week we're looking at age assessments. The week after that we're going to do a back to basics session, because a lot of people kind of enjoy those. Let's just get back to some of the basics, the foundations. We're going to be going back to basics with reflection. I'm not too sure yet what the title might be. I was just thinking it might be just titled Reflection. What? No reflection? I'm just thinking we might even go along the lines of that. I'm not sure yet, but it'll be a back to basics on the vital importance of reflective practice. And then the team and I are going to take a short break, not for too long. We will be back in January. We did talk about this, whether we're going to take a break. We've worked really hard on these webinars. We had no idea when we started them how long we were going to carry on doing them for. But we figured, look, we've done 26 when we take a break, and that's exactly, Chris worked it out for us and made the, let's go for 26, and then it's exactly half a year. So 26 sessions, there's 52 weeks a year. We'll have done exactly half a year, but we are coming back with loads of really, the topics we've got for next year and the guests we've got for next year, fabulous stuff. And we will always invite people back, and we'll always do sessions that you want to do. So yeah, Kelly's saying there, we might give you something to watch on a Wednesday, but not a live webinar, but something, we might do something for you. But I think we just need to have a bit of a break. I think the guys have got loads of assignments due and all kinds of things, so we'll take a short break, but we will be back. I think it's only about 6 weeks, isn't it? I think we're going to take off, and then we'll be back in January. So it's definitely not an ending. It's definitely, we are coming back, but we've got 2 more sessions left before we take a break. So thank you ever so much. Thank you to Claire. Thank you for the team, as ever, working really hard on things. So I'm just going to pass, I think, to you, Claire, for the final, for you to end our session. We can't have a guest speaker about endings and then I end the session. I think I've got to hand it over to you to conclude the session off for us. So my thanks, and I know the thanks of all the team. I'm looking at the WhatsApp group and everybody's going, oh, these are really great ideas. Oh, this has been a great session. So I know the team have really enjoyed it too. So thank you very much, but I'm going to hand over to you to end the session, and then the tech team then switches off.
All right, thanks Siobhan, thank you very much. And those I love your back to basics sessions. I think they're really great for experienced practice educators and students alike. Okay, so to end then, really, I guess I just wanted to say that I started the session saying I'm just going to talk to my small student hub, and that's what I'm going to imagine and keep in my mind. And I guess as I went through the session and I was seeing the chat and seeing the polls, I was thinking about the process in building a relationship, and I was thinking how I started off thinking I'm only just going to focus on 15 people, and actually throughout doing the slides and interacting through the polls and seeing people's responses, I almost felt like I was beginning to develop a relationship with the wider group and accept that I was speaking to however many hundreds of people we've got in here. And so I was almost thinking of how we went round through that Macmillan's model there and ended up feeling quite comfortable to engage and to hopefully enable and now to end. And so I just want to say thank you very much for sticking with me and building that relationship with me through that webinar, and thank you to Siobhan and the team, and I hope that some of you get some real pleasure in using those tools and reflecting and thinking about those with the people that you work with. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks, Claire. And I suppose the ultimate ending comes from the tech team switching us off. Night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.